Do you remember those silly items from the 1970s? The ones that seemed like jokes but turned out to be brilliant? These items made everyday life easier, brighter, and more playful than we realized. What hidden genius were we too quick to laugh off back then? Instant Polaroid cameras with self-developing film looked like an oversized gadget that nobody really needed. The cameras were bulky, and watching a blurry square piece of paper slide out the front seemed more like a parlor trick than serious photography. Yet in reality, this invention was nothing short of brilliant. Families could take a picture and actually hold it in their hands minutes later. No darkroom, no film developer, no expensive shop visit. That was magic in the 1970s. Kids waved the photo in the air as it slowly came to life, and every birthday, holiday, or summer vacation had instant proof right there on the table. The moment of waiting and watching the image appear became part of the fun, turning photography into an event rather than just a record. People often gathered around the print, laughing or gasping as the picture revealed itself. It was a shared ritual that made every snapshot feel special. Professional photographers even used them for test shots, knowing right away how a setup would look. People laughed at Polaroids for being clunky, but they did something film could never do: give you instant memories. For millions of Americans, it made photography feel more personal and more playful. Looking back, what seemed silly became a revolution that changed how we capture our lives. Solar-powered watches were called gimmicks when they first appeared. The idea of wearing a timepiece that could run on sunlight sounded like a science project, not a practical tool. People joked that you would be late if the clouds came out. But these watches worked, and they showed the world that renewable energy could power small, everyday items. The tiny solar panels were fascinating to look at, and kids were drawn to them like toys from the future. Adults discovered that they rarely needed to replace a battery, making them dependable in a way most watches were not. For many, they were the first time everyday technology connected directly to the natural world. They also sparked conversations about energy use in classrooms, making kids curious about science and the environment. Even skeptics had to admit they were surprisingly reliable once they gave them a chance. They were an early sign of wearable tech, long before fitness trackers or smartwatches appeared on the scene. What started as a novelty ended up as a quiet lesson that clean energy was not just possible, but useful. These silly little watches planted seeds for the technology we depend on today. Touch-tone phones looked flashy but unnecessary when they replaced rotary dials. People had spent decades spinning circles with their fingers, so pressing buttons seemed almost like cheating. Why fix something that worked just fine? Yet those tones made calling faster, smoother, and easier. They also laid the foundation for automated systems, banking by phone, and even early computer connections. Children loved playing with the musical tones, discovering they could tap out songs on the keypad. Some households even had competitions to see who could dial the fastest, a small but funny perk of button pushing over rotary. The tones themselves became part of pop culture, sampled in songs and mimicked in comedy sketches. What began as a convenience quickly turned into a sound that defined modern communication. Businesses realized how much time was saved when employees did not have to wait for a dial to spin back around. What once felt silly became the standard for decades. In time, the very sound of those tones came to represent modern communication, a small innovation that changed how the world connected. Floppy disks looked fragile, thin, and laughably weak. Holding one in your hand, you could bend it slightly and wonder how it could possibly hold anything important. But in the 1970s, these little squares became the backbone of home computing. They stored programs, documents, and even games in a way that was portable and easy to share. Schools used them to teach children the basics of computers, passing lessons from one machine to another. Families could load up word processors or simple games by sliding one into a drive that whirred loudly as if something amazing was happening. Even though each disk only held a tiny amount of data by modern standards, it felt like having a library in your pocket. Children traded disks like baseball cards, sharing programs and games on the playground. Offices became more efficient as workers carried important files between computers without stacks of paper. Companies relied on them for everything from accounting to design. What looked silly and fragile at first was actually the gateway to the digital age. Without floppy disks, computers might have remained stuck in labs and offices. They were the silly little squares that carried the future. Roller suitcases with pull handles drew smirks when they first hit airports. People said travelers were lazy for not wanting to carry their luggage. Real travelers, they claimed, carried their bags proudly on their shoulders. But once people tried rolling a heavy suitcase across an airport floor, they never wanted to go back. Suddenly, long trips became easier for families, business travelers, and anyone without the strength to haul 50 pounds through a terminal. Children could pull their own bags, and older travelers could keep moving without strain. They also changed the entire design of airports, as more travelers could handle longer distances between gates without exhaustion. The luggage industry exploded with new designs, sizes, and materials once wheels became the standard. What was mocked as laziness quickly became seen as smart travel planning. The design seemed simple, but it transformed how the world moved. Within a few years, nearly every suitcase on the market had wheels and a handle. What started as a silly-seeming invention became one of the most brilliant travel upgrades of the century. Digital alarm clocks with snooze buttons were mocked as lazy inventions. Critics said people should wake up when the alarm rang, not roll over for 5 more minutes. But the snooze button quietly reshaped mornings across America. Families adjusted their routines with those extra minutes of rest, making mornings a little more manageable. The red glowing numbers on the clock face looked futuristic compared to ticking hands. Some people even claimed the red glow gave bedrooms an eerie, space-age feel, like living in a science fiction movie. Others loved that the display was easy to read in the middle of the night without fumbling for glasses. It was futuristic but also comforting, a strange mix that fit the 1970s perfectly. Teenagers used them to avoid missing the school bus, and adults grew to depend on that comforting option to delay the day just a little longer. The digital alarm clock turned out to be more than a gadget. It was a lifestyle change. By the 1980s, it was as common as a toaster, proof that something silly can become an everyday essential. Cassette car stereos with auto reverse were considered gimmicks when they first came out. People said it was not hard to flip a tape, so why bother? But once drivers realized they could listen to an entire album without touching the deck, the feature felt like luxury. Road trips became smoother, and music flowed without interruption. Teenagers blasting their favorite bands could keep their hands on the wheel, while families enjoyed long drives without fumbling in the glove box. The constant music also made long commutes feel less lonely, turning a simple drive into a personal concert. Drivers felt like they were living in the future when their favorite song played seamlessly from one side of the tape to the other. The simple act of not flipping a cassette turned into a surprisingly big deal for everyday life. Car stereos had already transformed driving culture, but auto reverse turned it into a non-stop concert. What seemed silly was actually a small piece of brilliance that made music more enjoyable and safer on the road. Clear telephones with exposed wires looked like toys instead of serious equipment. Parents worried they would break, and critics said they were tacky, but for kids and teenagers, they were the coolest way to talk to friends. The colorful wires and see-through plastic made technology visible and fun. Suddenly, phones felt less like appliances and more like personal accessories. The look also captured the playful spirit of the decade when bright colors and bold designs took over everything from furniture to clothing. Having one in your bedroom was a status symbol that said you were stylish and modern. Even the sound of the ring seemed cooler coming from a clear phone. Friends spent hours gossiping through transparent handsets, feeling like they were holding a piece of the future. Designers discovered that style could matter just as much as function. What looked silly became a trend that sold millions, and it proved that technology could be fashionable too. Inflatable furniture made living rooms look like playrooms. Bright colors, plastic surfaces, and the constant risk of deflation made them seem like a joke. But for college students and young families, they were affordable, portable, and surprisingly practical. You could fill a room with chairs and couches for a fraction of the cost of traditional furniture. When it was time to move, they could be deflated, rolled up, and carried under one arm. They also matched the adventurous decor style of the 1970s, when people were not afraid to try bold, unusual designs. Bright orange, neon green, and hot pink inflatables became conversation starters at parties. For those on a tight budget, they felt like a fun way to live modern without spending much. Parties became more fun with wild shapes and bold colors filling small apartments. The fad faded, but inflatable furniture showed that style and accessibility could come together. What once seemed like a silly plastic gimmick was actually a step toward modern design on a budget. DIY electronics kits from Radio Shack looked nerdy and intimidating to most kids. Rows of resistors, wires, and circuit boards hardly seemed exciting compared to toys or games. Yet these kits turned curious children into future engineers. They taught problem-solving, patience, and the thrill of building something that actually worked. Many kids discovered the basics of coding and circuitry by snapping wires into breadboards or soldering small parts together. Some even went on to build their own radios, calculators, or early computer projects using the skills they learned. Teachers encouraged parents to buy the kits, saying they developed real-world abilities instead of just providing entertainment. What looked like a geeky hobby was actually laying the foundation for America's growing tech culture. Parents thought it was a strange hobby, but it sparked lifelong passions and even careers. The kits gave an entire generation hands-on experience with technology at a time when computers were just entering homes. What seemed silly and geeky was actually one of the most brilliant ways to prepare children for the digital world that was coming. Swivel rocker recliners were often laughed at as lazy chairs, a piece of furniture for people who wanted to sit, spin, and nap without moving a muscle. Critics thought they were clunky and unattractive, something you would hide in the basement rather than showcase in the living room. But for families in the 1970s, these chairs were pure comfort and surprisingly ahead of their time. The swivel made it easy to turn toward the television, the kitchen, or even the kids playing nearby without straining your back. The rocking motion soothed parents, babies, and even grandparents, making it one of the most versatile seats in the house. And of course, the reclining feature turned long evenings into moments of pure relaxation. For people working long hours or coming home tired, this was the one piece of furniture that delivered on its promise. They may have looked funny to design critics, but ergonomically, swivel rocker recliners were brilliant. They gave Americans a taste of furniture that worked with the body instead of against it. Today, modern recliners owe much of their success to this so-called silly fad of the 1970s. Cordless electric razors were dismissed at first as weak, gimmicky, and unable to compete with the traditional blade or corded models. Men worried they would not give a close shave, while women doubted they would last through a grooming session without dying. But when people tried them, they realized just how revolutionary they were. You could shave on the go, in a car, at the office, or even in a locker room, all without plugging in. The portability made grooming faster and more flexible than ever before. For teenagers just starting to shave, cordless razors were less intimidating than sharp blades. They also symbolized freedom at a time when personal grooming was becoming part of modern identity. Advertisements showed men shaving in airports or cars, making the razor look futuristic and mobile. That image stuck, turning grooming into something sleek and efficient instead of slow and routine. For adults, they saved precious minutes in the morning rush. Yes, early versions sometimes ran out of battery or missed spots, but convenience outweighed the flaws. The idea that you could groom anywhere without cords changed how people thought about personal care. What was laughed off as underpowered became the first step toward modern grooming technology. Early jogging suits looked goofy, no question. The shiny fabrics, loud colors, and matching zip-up tops made people look like they had stepped out of a comic strip. At first, only serious runners wore them, and even then, neighbors stared. But as jogging caught on in the 1970s, these suits became symbols of health, energy, and a new way of life. They kept muscles warm, made running comfortable, and encouraged people to take fitness seriously. Soon, everyone from suburban dads to Hollywood celebrities was wearing them, not just for exercise but also for casual outings. They gave people permission to dress for comfort rather than formality, which was a radical cultural shift. Wearing jogging suits in public blurred the line between working out and living everyday life. That shift made health and fitness part of daily culture instead of just a niche hobby. They blurred the line between athletic gear and everyday clothing, paving the way for the athleisure trend we live in today. What seemed like a silly costume at first ended up starting a fitness fashion revolution. America's love of jogging suits launched a cultural shift where health and lifestyle merged into something visible and celebrated. Tape answering machines were big, clunky, and awkward to use. They required miniature cassette tapes that often jammed, and the sound quality was scratchy at best. Many people dismissed them as a luxury or a nuisance. Who needed a robot to take a message? But in practice, they changed communication forever. For the first time, families could leave the house without missing important calls. Businesses could record customer inquiries after hours. Teenagers used them to screen calls from friends or avoid conversations with parents. They also gave people more control over their time, which was a new concept in daily life. Suddenly, you could decide who to call back and when, instead of being tied to the ringing phone. This shift made privacy and boundaries possible in ways the telephone never had before. The concept of voicemail started right here, with clunky boxes that looked silly on desks. Answering machines also brought personality into homes, as people recorded funny or dramatic greetings to entertain callers. Even though technology has moved far past cassette tapes, the idea of leaving a message when someone cannot answer began with these awkward little machines. They were the beginning of a culture where people could connect without being present. Early electronic calculators that talked were mocked as novelties. The robotic voices sounded flat and strange, and critics said nobody needed a machine to read out numbers. But these calculators were quietly groundbreaking. They made math accessible for the visually impaired, offering spoken answers when screens could not be read. Teachers discovered that the talking feature helped students double-check work and learn in new ways. Children were fascinated by the voice, treating the calculators like futuristic toys. Some parents even worried the machines would make kids too dependent, but others saw them as learning tools. They created excitement in classrooms where technology usually felt intimidating. For many students, hearing numbers aloud made math less frightening and more engaging. And while they seemed silly at the time, they foreshadowed the rise of voice assistants, from talking GPS units to smart home devices. These clunky talking calculators were early proof that hearing information could be just as useful as seeing it. They may have been laughed at in classrooms, but they pointed toward a future where technology would talk back to us in ways nobody expected. Self-watering plant pots were a niche gadget in the 1970s, something gardeners shrugged at and skeptics rolled their eyes over. Why complicate a simple task like watering plants? But these pots solved a real problem for busy families. A hidden reservoir let plants draw up water as needed, preventing them from drying out during hot summers or when homeowners forgot to water. Vacationers no longer had to beg neighbors to keep their plants alive. Indoor gardeners discovered that even delicate herbs and flowers thrived in these pots. They also encouraged experimentation, with people trying out exotic houseplants they never would have dared to grow before. Garden magazines of the time even began featuring them as futuristic gadgets that might change gardening forever. In truth, they gave confidence to beginners who felt nervous about keeping anything alive. The quirky design also made them conversation pieces, something guests would notice and ask about. Some households even treated them as status symbols, proof that you were modern and up to date on trends. What started as a gardening gadget quietly became a lifestyle accessory. They looked a little funny, with tubes and compartments, but they were quietly brilliant. They made plant care accessible for people without green thumbs. Over time, the concept became standard, and now self-watering planters are everywhere, from garden shops to office desks. What once looked silly was simply ahead of its time. plug-in air fresheners were brushed off as fake, artificial, and unnecessary. Why spend money on plastic cartridges when you could just open a window? But in the 1970s, they introduced something new: continuous fragrance without effort. Unlike candles or sprays, which faded quickly, these little devices kept homes smelling fresh around the clock. They were a novelty, but also a clever marketing tool that made scent part of home design. Families discovered that certain fragrances created mood, comfort, or even the illusion of cleanliness. Some homeowners swore a good scent made guests believe the house was cleaner than it really was. Companies quickly realized the potential and rolled out dozens of scents, from pine forests to apple pie. Before long, people were choosing fragrances to match holidays, seasons, and even personalities. Critics laughed at the idea of plugging in perfume, but consumers loved the convenience. The air freshener industry grew into a giant, all starting with these so-called silly gadgets. Today, plug-in scents are everywhere, but their roots trace back to 1970s experiments that once seemed laughable. Magnetic refrigerator poetry strips, or their earliest do-it-yourself versions, looked like kitchen clutter. Small word magnets scattered across the fridge door seemed more like mess than decor. But they unlocked creativity in unexpected ways. Families left jokes, love notes, and silly messages for each other. Children practiced spelling and sentence building without even realizing they were learning. Artists used the randomness to spark new ideas. For many, the kitchen refrigerator became a kind of public bulletin board where thoughts and feelings were shared daily. Even simple three-word sentences could create laughter or start conversations. What seemed like clutter was actually turning ordinary homes into spaces of connection and imagination. What looked like a silly waste of space was actually a brilliant tool for communication and imagination. It turned the refrigerator into the heart of the home, not just for food, but for creativity. Over time, refrigerator poetry became a cultural phenomenon, showing how playful design could encourage connection. Novelty ice cube trays shaped like stars, hearts, or other designs were mocked as unnecessary and silly. Who needed ice to be cute when it only melted anyway? But these trays did something important. They turned everyday parties into moments of fun and gave hosts a creative edge. Children loved them in summer drinks, and adults found they made cocktails stand out. The idea spread quickly, and before long, shaped ice was a staple of entertaining. They also sparked creativity in kitchen design, inspiring other playful tools like cookie cutters, gelatin molds, and pancake shapes. Party hosts loved the way a small detail could surprise and delight guests. What seemed like a frivolous touch actually became an easy way to make gatherings feel special. These trays also encouraged innovation in kitchenware, proving people would spend money on small details that made life more playful. What started as a silly party trick became the foundation of a massive industry in novelty kitchen design. Electric can openers were branded as unnecessary by skeptics who said a manual opener worked just fine. But in households across America, they were a small miracle. They opened cans quickly, easily, and without straining wrists or cutting hands. For elderly people, those with arthritis, or anyone with limited hand strength, they made a huge difference. Families discovered that cooking became faster when you did not have to wrestle with a stubborn lid. Children could safely use them too, giving them more independence in helping around the kitchen. Appliance companies leaned into the convenience angle, advertising them as the modern way to cook. Even though some mocked them as gadgets, millions of families discovered they genuinely saved time and effort. The machines looked funny sitting on countertops, buzzing loudly as they worked, but they were practical. They brought convenience and accessibility into kitchens that were often overlooked. What started as a silly gadget became a must-have tool for millions of homes. Swim caps with crazy patterns and flowers were some of the silliest-looking accessories to appear in American pools during the 1970s. Imagine a swim cap covered in neon daisies or oversized plastic petals that turned a serious lap swimmer into a floating bouquet. People laughed at them, and teenagers often refused to wear them out of embarrassment. But for many families, especially mothers who spent afternoons taking kids to swim lessons or community pools, these caps were lifesavers. They kept chlorine out of hair, reduced the time spent shampooing, and prevented hair dye from fading too fast. The colorful designs also helped children stand out in crowded pools, making it easier for parents to keep an eye on them. Swimmers who embraced the look often found themselves remembered for their bold style long after the season ended. The designs may have been silly, but they turned an ordinary cap into something people talked about. What looked ridiculous from a distance was actually a thoughtful blend of style and function. They encouraged self-expression even in the most practical moments, proving that utility did not have to be boring. Over time, swim caps became symbols of retro fun, remembered fondly for the way they brightened up otherwise plain swimwear. They may have been mocked at the time, but they showed that even small details could bring joy to everyday routines. Novelty light switch covers were another example of 1970s decor that made people chuckle. Instead of plain white plates, you suddenly had covers shaped like animals, cartoon characters, or bold geometric designs. Some looked childish, others tacky, and critics dismissed them as clutter. But they represented something bigger happening in American homes: customization. Families were beginning to move away from cookie-cutter decor, wanting their homes to reflect personality. A child's bedroom might feature a superhero switch plate, while the kitchen had a sunflower design. These tiny additions gave every room a playful identity. Even though some scoffed, homeowners loved the freedom to make small details their own. It was proof that even ordinary items could feel personal and fun. They were inexpensive, easy to install, and could be swapped out with new designs as tastes changed. More importantly, they normalized the idea that even the smallest parts of a home could be customized. What seemed silly and unnecessary was actually the start of a larger movement towards self-expression in interior design. Today's endless options in home decor trace back to those playful little switch covers that dared to be different. See-through raincoats drew plenty of laughs when they hit the market. Transparent plastic coats made people look like they were wrapped in cellophane, and critics argued they were more fashion faux pas than protection. But they were surprisingly functional. Unlike heavy rubber coats, these were lightweight, easy to carry, and provided full protection from rain without overheating. The see-through design meant you could still show off your outfit underneath, a subtle but important detail for people who did not want rain gear ruining their style. For parents, see-through coats made it easy to spot children in a crowd. For commuters, they folded up neatly and could be tucked into bags. Some people even styled them deliberately, pairing bold outfits with the clear plastic to make the clothes underneath stand out. Others treated them as a fashion statement, embracing the futuristic look of the decade. They may have looked silly, but they were brilliant in blending practicality with fashion. The see-through trend also hinted at a cultural shift toward futuristic, space-age aesthetics that dominated 1970s design. While many people laughed at the idea of wearing plastic coats, others embraced them as bold statements. Looking back, they were not just rain gear. They were a playful experiment in combining style with utility. Quirky plastic Tupperware toys like Play-Doh mop tops seemed goofy compared to high-end toys of the time. They were simple, colorful, and often involved pushing or squeezing plastic parts to create shapes or characters. Many adults thought they looked cheap or gimmicky, but for children, they were magical tools of imagination. They encouraged creativity by letting kids build, mold, and invent their own games. Unlike fragile toys, these plastic creations were nearly indestructible, making them perfect for family households. They also reflected the post-war era's love for plastic, affordable, durable, and endlessly versatile. Toys did not need to be complicated to be brilliant. They just needed to spark a child's imagination. Parents loved that they were safe, affordable, and kept kids entertained for hours. These toys also reflected the broader Tupperware culture of the era, when plastic containers and kitchenware were everywhere in American homes. By turning leftover plastic into playful designs, Tupperware bridged practicality and fun. What seemed goofy was actually a clever way of using design to spark creativity in children while keeping costs low. Decades later, many adults still remember these quirky toys fondly, proof that brilliance often hides behind silliness. Giant remote controls, often wired clickers, looked like oversized toys rather than serious gadgets. They were heavy, sometimes awkward, and the loud clicking noise they made drew plenty of jokes. At first, families mocked them as lazy devices. Why not just walk to the television and change the channel yourself? But these remotes marked the beginning of a cultural shift. For the first time, people had the power to control the television from across the room. Children competed to hold the remote, while parents enjoyed the convenience of adjusting volume or channels without leaving their chairs. The novelty quickly turned into habit, and soon, nobody wanted to give up the privilege of control. Families may have joked about laziness, but they also fought over who held the clicker. The design may have been clunky, but it introduced the idea of interactive control over entertainment. That one silly-looking gadget was the seed that grew into the remote culture we still live in today. It changed how families watched television, shaping habits that would last for generations. The giant clickers may have been mocked in the 1970s, but they were brilliant in paving the way for the sleek remotes, streaming devices, and voice assistants we use now. Skiing was never the same once neon showed up. I am talking full spectrum, retina-searing neon, electric pink, screaming lime green, safety cone orange, sometimes all at once. You were not skiing. You were glowing. The 1980s fashion scene decided subtlety was canceled, and nowhere was that more obvious than on the slopes. It was like someone dared the ski community to look like walking glow sticks, and they all said, "Challenge accepted." Ski suits looked like outer space met a Lisa Frank notebook. But here is the thing. When the snow settled, all that color had nowhere to go. Once the decade ended, people looked at their slope selfies and realized they had been dressing like traffic signs. Neon was everywhere for a hot minute. Even the zippers had attitude. And if you were not blinded by your jacket, then someone else's was probably reflecting directly into your eyes. That was not just fashion, it was a safety hazard. But at least you had room to move, right? Speaking of movement, the next 1980s trend thought bouncing was the future of fitness and fun, and totally not sprained ankles. TV dinners turned the living room into a dining room, one foil tray at a time. They were not new in the 1960s, but this was the decade they really took off, just as television became the centerpiece of American family life. You got a little compartment for meatloaf, one for mashed potatoes, another for corn, maybe a brownie tucked into the corner. All you had to do was pop it in the oven, wait, and serve. No planning, no cleanup, no arguing over what to cook. The tray itself felt futuristic. Everything had its place. The food was not gourmet, but it was warm, salty, and comforting in its predictability. Families could eat while watching their favorite shows. Kids could feel like grown-ups with their own personal meal. The appeal was clear, fast, easy, and made to match the rhythm of modern life. TV dinners were more than just food. They were a new way to eat, one that said it was okay to sit on the couch and focus on The Ed Sullivan Show or Bonanza. The clang of a fork against aluminum still echoes in memory. For many, it was the sound of dinner and television becoming one. They were not just jewelry. They were emotion captured in metal, worn like a secret code on your finger. Mood rings did not just change color. They whispered things you were too young to say out loud. When you slipped one on, it felt like magic. Blue meant calm, green meant normal. Black, well, no one wanted to see black. The science behind it was simple, but no one cared. In the 1970s, the idea that your feelings could show themselves in color felt like truth. These rings were traded like treasures on the schoolyard. You watched your crush's ring for signs. You checked your own to see if it matched your mood, or maybe told you what mood you should be in. It made your hands feel important, as if something hidden inside you finally had a way out. Kids compared colors, speculated meanings, and even blamed the ring for their temper or shyness. It was all play, but it meant everything. Adults wore them too, sometimes seriously, as if their stress and calm could be measured like temperature. Mood rings promised answers. They gave shape to confusion and mood swings and heart flutters. They made your emotions visible even when you could not find the words. Today, We track our health with digital watches and screens, but nothing feels quite as mystical as a little color-changing stone that said, without saying, "You feel something, and that matters." You were not just writing letters in the 1980s. You were sending sensory experiences. Perfumed stationery sets were the peak of pen pal drama. Heart-shaped pages with lace borders, sparkly envelopes, and enough floral scent to knock out a small room. There were sets that smelled like roses, vanilla, ocean breeze, or something suspiciously like bubblegum and detergent. You would open a note from your best friend and nearly pass out from the aroma. It was like the page had bathed in perfume and never toweled off. They were beautiful, romantic, and borderline unreadable. The ink would smudge from the coated paper. The scent would linger for days. And if you tried mailing one of these in the heat, good luck. The envelope might as well have been dipped in cologne. Still, it was all part of the charm. These notes were not meant to last forever. They were moments frozen in scent. They smelled like crushes and sleepovers and secrets told in cursive. But not all nostalgia smells sweet. Because the next 1980s trend? It came with a can of hairspray, a comb, and enough height to qualify as a fire hazard. Shoulder pads were not just a trend, they were a transformation. You could put on a blazer and suddenly feel like a corporate warrior, even if you were just headed to homeroom. The goal was to look powerful, confident, and vaguely like a football player on a job interview. From business suits to casual blouses, shoulder pads invaded every piece of clothing in the 1980s. You could not escape them. They were sewn in, velcroed on, or added as an afterthought to make your silhouette scream important. The bigger the pad, the better. Entire generations walked around with squared-off shoulders and structured poise, looking ready to charge into a boardroom or a runway. Some tried to remove them only to realize the entire shirt deflated without the padding. They were ridiculous, and we knew it. But they worked. You stood a little taller, felt a little braver, and if someone bumped into you in the hallway, your outfit absorbed the blow. Looking back now, they seem comically oversized, but at the time they were armor, fashion armor. And for anyone who wore them, they were a reminder that style was not just about looking good, it was about looking like you meant business. Barrel of Monkeys was proof that the simplest ideas can last the longest. Released in 1965, the game came in a bright plastic barrel filled with plastic monkeys that linked together by their arms. That was it. No batteries, no board, no setup time. Just spill the monkeys and try to link as many as you could without dropping the chain. It was harder than it looked. The curved arms never seemed to hook just right, and one wrong move could send your whole line tumbling. But when you did it, when you made it past 10 or 15 monkeys, it felt like a small miracle. Kids would challenge each other to beat their records, dump and restart over and over, totally absorbed. The monkeys themselves were colorful, cheerful, and perfectly palm-sized. The game traveled well. It lived in car glove boxes, grandma's house drawers, and birthday party goodie bags. Decades later, the design remains almost unchanged, which says something about how right they got it the first time. Before screens took over fidget time, there was just you, a barrel, and 24 tiny monkeys daring you to beat your best. Before trading cards became high-stakes business and digital downloads replaced bubblegum comics, there were wacky packages. Small, sticky, and hilarious, these stickers were everything a kid needed to feel like they were part of something clever. They parodied real brands, Cap'n Crud cereal, Crust toothpaste, and poked fun at the everyday items in your kitchen. For children of the 1970s, they were rebellion in cartoon form. You could stick them on lockers, notebooks, lunchboxes, anywhere adults would frown and kids would laugh. It was satire before you even knew the word. You felt in on the joke, like the world was just a little less serious when you had a wacky package in hand. Packs were cheap. The thrill of tearing them open was pure adrenaline. Would you get one you already had? Would you find a rare one? The collecting was addictive, the trading even more so. Schoolyards turned into mini stock exchanges, where one kid's duplicate could be your treasure. Teachers hated them. Parents rolled their eyes, but that just made them cooler. These stickers were the beginning of a lifelong love of irony and humor for many. They taught you to question branding, to laugh at consumerism, that maybe not everything sold to you was sacred. And now, decades later, you can still picture the garish art, the warped logos, and the feeling of being clever, just for laughing at laundry detergent. Now imagine being a kid in the 1980s. You see a commercial where a kid is floating through the air like they are on the moon. Enter moon shoes, mini trampolines for your feet. A miracle of plastic, rubber bands, and hope. The packaging promised anti-gravity fun. But what you got was 2 slabs of plastic that shook your ankles into submission. You strapped them onto your sneakers, took a few hopeful jumps, and within 5 minutes, you were sitting on the ground nursing a bruised shin. They were supposed to be fun. Instead, they became an unofficial rite of passage for backyard injuries. Sure, you might get one satisfying bounce in before the strap snapped off or your foot twisted sideways like it had a mind of its own. But that did not stop kids from begging for them. We were promised space adventures. We got orthopedic bills. Still, for one fleeting second, you felt like an astronaut. And then you remembered you were just in the driveway, stuck in a pair of squeaky plastic traps. But if your feet were not being tortured, chances are your telephone was, because the next trend had a serious case of over-accessorizing. Mall food court hangouts were not about the food, they were about freedom. Teenagers in the 1980s treated the mall like their second home, wandering its air-conditioned halls with nothing but pocket change and big plans to do absolutely nothing. The food court was the epicenter. Tables filled with cliques, couples, and groups of giggling friends stretched out time between slices of greasy pizza and soft pretzels. One soda could last hours, especially when refills were free. You scoped out crushes, eavesdropped on drama, and occasionally made eye contact with someone cool enough to nod back. Parents dropped you off and picked you up hours later, trusting the mall to act like a babysitter with bright lights and security guards. Whether you sat near the arcade or tucked into the corner by Orange Julius, the food court was a social stage. It was loud, it was messy, and it felt like your world. Every weekend brought the same faces, the same greasy trays, and the same comforting rhythm of adolescent independence. No one talked about it like it was special, but for those who grew up there, it was the perfect mix of noise, neon, and growing up in public. G.I. Joe changed everything the moment he marched onto toy shelves in 1964. Marketed not as a doll, but as an action figure, he offered boys the same kind of character-driven play that girls had with Barbie, but with a combat boot twist. The original 12-inch figure came with a military uniform, dog tags, and enough flexibility to strike a pose or take a fall. Kids could swap out his gear, helmets, rifles, backpacks, even scuba suits, and send him off on missions across the living room or backyard battlefield. It was the height of the Cold War, and Joe reflected that tension, but filtered through a child's sense of adventure. Over time, he evolved into a whole universe of characters, vehicles, and storylines. But those first editions were pure, iconic, and endlessly played with. G.I. Joe was a soldier, a sailor, an adventurer. He climbed trees, dove into mud puddles, and slept in shoebox barracks. For many boys growing up in the 1960s, he was the first toy that truly felt like theirs. He was more than plastic. He was valor, imagination, and action rolled into one heroic pose. And every kid who owned one remembers how it felt to gear him up for battle. Charlie's Angels was not just a television show, it was a cultural awakening in bell-bottoms and feathered hair. In an era when women were still fighting for equal footing, this trio of private detectives kicked down the door with high heels and high style. Sabrina, Jill, and Kelly were not sidekicks. They were the stars, and every week, millions tuned in to watch them outsmart villains, fight crime, and still look flawless. It was action. It was glamour. And for a lot of young girls, it was a revelation. These women were strong, smart, dangerous, and they did it all without needing permission. They were not waiting to be rescued. They were the ones doing the rescuing. For boys, it was a crush. For girls, it was a blueprint. Watching them felt like seeing the future, one where women were just as bold and capable as anyone else. Yes, the show was campy. Yes, it leaned hard into style. But underneath the glossy surface was something powerful: representation. Every time the angels walked into danger with confidence, another crack formed in the glass ceiling. And for the kids growing up in the 1970s, those cracks mattered. They signaled that maybe, just maybe, the world was changing. Before cell phones, there were landlines. And before minimalism, there were designer phone covers. And boy, did the 1980s go all in. You could not just have a phone, you had to dress it. We are talking fur-lined receivers, leopard print handsets, and rhinestone-covered cradles. Nothing screamed glamour like trying to have a conversation with what looked like a bedazzled chinchilla pressed against your ear. There was even one that looked like a hamburger. Why? No one really knows. But the 1980s were not about asking why. They were about asking, does this come in glitter pink? People wanted their rotary phones to match their shag carpet and floral wallpaper, and these accessories delivered poorly. The covers fell apart. They muffled the sound. And let us be honest, no emergency call was improved by digging through a layer of sequins. It turned something simple into a full-time job. You had to prepare to use your phone. The trend eventually fizzled out, mostly because the novelty wore off and the practicality never existed in the first place. Still, the 1980s loved their flair, especially when you could wear it, like, say, around your neck in the most jingly way possible. Over-the-top hairdos in the 1980s were less about style and more about spectacle. To get that perfect towering poof or side-swept shell, you needed a can of hairspray in one hand and a teasing comb in the other. Some mornings, the bathroom turned into a construction site. Hair was sprayed, scrunched, fluffed, and frozen into place like a sculpture that dared not move. Mousse was slathered on like sunscreen, followed by heat from a curling iron so hot it could leave permanent dents in your bangs. It was a daily battle between gravity and vanity usually won. The bigger the hair, the closer to cool. Class photos from the decade show clouds of bangs, mile-high ponytails, and helmets of blonde that could survive a wind tunnel. Everyone walked around smelling faintly of aerosol. Some kids were practically flammable, but at the time, it was worth it. You judged your popularity by the size of your bangs. A flat head was social suicide. Looking back now, it seems absurd, but for those who lived it, there was no higher compliment than being told your hair looked totally rad. The Easy Bake Oven brought the thrill of baking into the tiny hands of children everywhere. Released by Kenner in 1963, it looked like a pastel-colored toy, but worked like real kitchen equipment, albeit powered by a common light bulb. Slide the cake tray in, wait just long enough for anticipation to bubble, and out came a warm, soft treat you made yourself. The cakes were tiny, the brownies a bit dense, but the pride was enormous. For many young kids, especially girls at the time, the Easy Bake Oven was a first taste of independence. No parental supervision needed, no open flames, just you and a cake mix in a miniature pan. It sparked creativity, confidence, and plenty of sibling rivalries over who got the bigger slice. The toy's appeal lasted for decades, but those original models with their sleek retro look and that gentle hum from the light bulb warming up have a special place in memory. Long before kids had screens and apps, this was hands-on, slightly messy, and totally satisfying play. The smell of a baking chocolate chip cake from a 40-watt bulb is not something you easily forget. They were not just about food storage. Tupperware parties were secret engines of community, commerce, and independence, especially for women in the 1970s. Step into a neighbor's home and you would see it. The pastel plastics lined up like soldiers, the promise of freshness sealed with a pop. But underneath the lids and labels was something deeper. These gatherings gave stay-at-home mothers a way to feel powerful. Selling meant earnings. Hosting meant purpose. Every product pitch was also a performance, a chance to shine in a world that often ignored domestic labor. Laughter echoed through kitchens. Stories were swapped between sales, and orders were written down with practiced excitement, Kids would peek around corners wondering why grown-ups were having so much fun over containers. It felt like a club, part practical, part glamorous. The catalog was a symbol of what your kitchen could be, how your life could be more organized, cleaner, even happier. For women who were told their value came from homemaking, these parties offered a small rebellion. You could make money. You could lead. You could do it all without leaving the house. And when the guests left with their bags of burping bowls and butter trays, it felt like more than shopping. It felt like success. These parties faded with time, replaced by online orders and supermarket shelves. But for one glittering decade, plastic containers were the foundation of something much bigger than leftovers. You knew a kid was cool if their necklace made noise from down the hallway. Enter the plastic charm necklace. These things were a fashion statement and a choking hazard all rolled into one. A long, brightly colored chain that you decked out with dozens of plastic trinkets. Mini roller skates, tiny telephones, hair dryers, soda bottles, and anything else the size of your thumb. The more charms, the better. It was like curating your own loud, clunky resume of childhood interests. Everyone traded them. Everyone bragged about having the rare ones. And of course, the plastic was cheap enough to snap if you breathed on it wrong. Teachers hated them. Parents hated stepping on them. But kids loved how collectible they felt. That is, until the day you leaned over your desk and your entire charm empire dumped itself on the floor like a sad little toy avalanche. Still, for a while, they were the perfect combination of fashion and fun. And speaking of things that looked fun but failed to function properly, do you remember the sweet-smelling school supply that never actually worked? Let us talk about rubber-scented erasers shaped like food. Slap bracelets were the toy that hit your wrist and hit peak popularity, almost overnight. They were simple. A metal strip wrapped in colorful fabric that snapped around your arm with one satisfying motion. One moment it was straight, the next it curled tight, clinging to your wrist like a coiled snake. Every kid had one. Some had dozens, trading them like currency during recess. They came in neon colors, animal prints, sparkles, and cartoon characters. The louder the snap, the better. Some kids got so good they could slap them onto their arms without looking. But with popularity came problems. Schools started banning them. Parents worried about the metal underneath. Rumors flew about kids cutting themselves open with a rogue bracelet that had been peeled apart. That only made them cooler. Everyone wanted the forbidden accessory. Teachers tried to confiscate them, but they always found their way back into backpacks and onto arms. Slap bracelets were fun, fast, and a little dangerous, just enough to feel rebellious. They were not just toys. They were fashion statements, fidget tools, and tiny thrills rolled into one. And even now, the sound of that sharp snap is enough to take you right back to 4th grade. Chatty Cathy was more than just a doll. She was the voice of a generation. Introduced by Mattel in 1960, she was one of the first mass-produced talking dolls, and for many little girls, she felt like a real friend. With her round face, blonde bob haircut, and soft vinyl limbs, she looked sweet enough. But the real magic happened when you pulled the cord on her back. Suddenly, Cathy could speak, saying phrases like, "Let's play school," or "I love you." She became a sensation almost overnight. Children were enchanted by her ability to talk back, even if her voice was tinny and slightly robotic. For parents, she was a marvel of engineering. For kids, she was a companion who never interrupted and always agreed. Cathy sparked a whole line of talking dolls and helped kick off a new wave of interactive toys. And although later toys would be flashier, louder, and more advanced, none carried the same simple wonder. For many, the sound of that pull string and the soft mechanical voice is a vivid echo of childhood. Chatty Cathy is often remembered not just for what she said, but for what it felt like to hear her talk for the first time. There was something sacred about Saturday mornings in the 1970s. Before the sun had a chance to fully warm the sidewalks, children would gather around boxy television sets, cereal bowls in hand, as the glow of cartoons lit up the room. There were no on-demand options, no rewinds, just that fleeting window where animated worlds came alive. Shows like Scooby-Doo, The Jetsons and Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids became more than entertainment. They were rituals as ingrained in childhood as scraped knees and secret treehouse meetings. Those opening theme songs became the soundtrack of a generation, each one latching onto memory like the scent of crayon wax or the feeling of Velcro shoes. Parents knew this time was sacred too. It was the one morning a week when the kids were quiet, transfixed, and content. The living room became a miniature theater, complete with the scent of toast and the sound of muffled laughter. Today, we scroll endlessly for something to watch, barely paying attention to what plays next. But back then, if you missed it, you missed it. That was part of the magic. Each cartoon was a one-time event, and those who were there remember. It was the childhood version of an appointment, circled not on a calendar, but etched into the rhythm of every kid's week. And when the final show ended, it felt like something wonderful had passed, just like the decade that gave it to us. You knew it was going to be a good school year when your pencil case smelled like a fruit salad. Rubber-scented erasers shaped like food were the peak of academic excitement in the 1980s. They looked like tiny hamburgers, donuts, pickles, even sushi rolls. If you were lucky, your set came with a tiny tray and a fake soda. They were bright, colorful, and smelled like someone spilled a bottle of air freshener in an art supply store. Only problem? They did not actually erase anything. If anything, they left behind more streaks than they removed. Still, no one really used them. You displayed them, you traded them, you clutched them like they were gold. And every now and then, someone tried to eat one just to see what would happen. It was childhood logic at its finest. If it smells like a strawberry milkshake, it must taste like one too, right? Wrong. But what these erasers lacked in function, they made up for in flair. They were tiny scented trophies of your youth. And while they never helped you pass math, they sure looked good on your desk. Speaking of things that looked great on the surface but did not last, let us hit play on a sound that defined a decade and then disappeared overnight. The synthesizer, the drum machine, the shoulder pads. Television Guide was the original streaming schedule, printed, folded, and worshipped. Each week, families flipped through its pages to plan their entire viewing life. What time is your show on? What channel is the big movie airing? Without a television guide, you were lost in the static. It listed every program, from early morning cartoons to late-night reruns. You circled shows in pen. You memorized time slots. You argued with siblings over what to watch and when. Sometimes you even set a timer on the VCR to record your favorites, if you could figure out how. Television Guide came with featured articles, behind-the-scenes trivia, and occasionally a glossy cover that made you feel like you were holding something special. It was not just a magazine, it was a map, a lifeline, and a reminder that missing your show meant waiting until summer reruns or, gasp, never seeing it again. Kids today will never understand the pressure of being ready at exactly 7 o'clock, or the heartbreak of flipping the page and realizing your favorite show was preempted by a holiday parade. The television guide was small, simple, and essential, and in a world before scrolling, it helped us find our way through the glow of the living room screen. Bugles arrived in 1966, and with them came a whole new shape of snacking. Shaped like tiny trumpets or cones, they were the snack you could eat or wear. Kids popped them onto their fingertips, wiggled their hands like claws, and then crunched them down one by one. But the novelty was not just in the shape. Bugles had a distinct texture, light, crispy, and a little flaky, that made them feel different from chips or pretzels. The corn-based flavor was salty, a little buttery, and oddly addictive. Unlike many snacks of the era, Bugles were not trying to copy something else. They were their own thing. Whether poured into a bowl for a party or packed into a lunchbox for recess, they brought a certain crunchy cheer to any setting. Parents liked that they were baked, not fried. Kids just liked that they were fun. Bugles became a staple of 1960s snack shelves alongside pretzel rods and Fritos, but they stood out for their playfulness. Even now, decades later, slipping a Bugle onto your finger sparks a flash of childhood. They were silly, satisfying, and one of the few snacks that doubled as a costume. There are hairstyles, And then there are structural engineering projects. Gravity-defying bangs held aloft by industrial-strength hairspray were the crown jewels of 1980s style. We are talking sky-high, shellacked to perfection, immovable bangs that could survive a hurricane. You did not just style your hair, you sculpted it. And the glue that held it all together? A can of Aquanet, the unofficial perfume of the decade. One spritz was never enough. You held that button down until the room filled with fog and your lungs begged for mercy. It was how you knew your bangs were officially done. They had to crunch when you tapped them. These bangs had volume, attitude, and possibly their own zip code. They required teasing, patience, and a total disregard for the ozone layer. Parents disapproved. Schools banned combs in lockers. But if your bangs did not touch the ceiling of your school photo backdrop, were you even living? It was extreme, it was ridiculous, and it was glorious. But eventually, the sky-high trend lost steam, and pastel blazers tried to take over the fashion throne. Spoiler alert, not everyone could pull off Crockett from Miami Vice. So before you go, share in the comments which silly item you secretly loved. And if this trip through the 1970s made you smile, hit like and subscribe so we can keep rediscovering forgotten brilliance together.